So my name's Daniel McCaffrey. I'm the general manager of platform and analytics at Zynga, so the engineering aspects of those pieces. So I'm going to talk to you today about how we're leveraging big data to make games more fun and social. Just real quick, some background that marketing makes me do. We're the world's leading social game developer. You see some of them there. We're also growing rapidly on web and mobile for third-party games. So we're building a platform. You're starting to see some of those come out, but over the next year, you're going to see a lot more as we build our own systems. So we're built on global platforms. That includes our own Zynga services that now we have an API on top of them. But of course, Facebook is a big one that we're on. There's Zynga.com, there's iOS, there's Android, there's Google+, there's Tencent.com. You can play with your friends, synchronous or asynchronously, cooperative or competitive. So now, just some of the numbers as we get into this. So Zynga has about 260 million monthly active users, and on any given day, there's about 60 million daily active users. So for the game data, the data that's really driving some of the core analytics that we use to change game design and product development, we're Vertica driven there at the core. We have a lot of different databases throughout the company, though, and we'll talk about that. But at the core, we're Vertica driven. We're doing 60 billion rows a day, real-time trickle in. So from the moment it's logged, it's available for reports within 5 minutes or less, usually less, in the case of Amazon Cloud versus our own clouds. That's about 10 terabytes of structured data per day. So if it was unstructured data, it would probably be much bigger. But this is highly structured data per day. Right now, the largest clusters have about 1.5 petabytes of source data in them at any given time. Those are growing. Our largest clusters are 230 nodes. These are 2U boxes. They're beefy commodity hardware boxes, lots of RAM, lots of disk spindles. We're moving towards 500 to 1,000 nodes. So we're at a big size now, and it's going much bigger. But we also have other systems. So we're using Splunk for a lot of the operational health monitoring for our servers. That's around 13 terabytes of log data, Apache logs, error logs, access logs, things like that. But then the archive data, we're looking at Hadoop, but we might possibly actually use Vertica for the archive storage of that data. And it looks like that's the direction that we're headed. So before we get into the actual services and the architecture, and leading into some of these discussions about what's the right tool for which job, because there's always different tools, but Dr. Stonebreaker has pointed out for years, and I think he's right. But what I wanted to cover was what were some of the starting core concepts for Zynga that drove us down this direction, and what made it so successful for Zynga. So obviously, one of the big ones for any analytics culture is a metrics-driven culture. You need C-staff on down, measuring goals through metrics. And oftentimes, it's metrics that you need on a daily basis. So that push for that kind of focus and constant iteration, experimentation, is what really helped us be successful in creating an analytics platform that costs a fair chunk of money. The other concept that we started with was analytics everywhere. We wanted open access to the data across the company. The only thing we locked down really is revenue. There's a few other exceptions. But pretty much everyone has access to the data throughout the company. We wanted open ad hoc access to the data. SQL traditionally was one way to do it. Easy external service integration. These were some of the things that we started with. So along those lines of ease of use and integration, what we were hoping for, this is almost 4 years ago now when we started, was we wanted easy standard tool integration. Of course, that's what everyone wants. And at that time, we wanted ELT, ETL tool integration, analysis tools, DB visualizers, reporting tools. We didn't want to try and reinvent the wheels there or wait for drivers and systems to come around for some of these other systems if we could. But we knew going that sort of more structured approach would cause some problems. So we knew we still had to be flexible on how we were capturing the data so that we weren't constantly changing schemas on the back end. But and we also wanted to centralize the data schemas for easier analysis. So instead of ending up with 50,000 tables, we wanted to control that from a central group. And I'll talk about some ways that worked for Zynga. Now, that doesn't work for everyone, because in a lot of cases, you have highly unstructured data that you can't apply control to. So in Zynga's case, we were able to do it, and that's part of the reason why this was so successful. Organizational structure, this one's another huge one. So we centralized a lot of these groups. So instead of having them being disparate and not communicating, They're all part of the same group. So we have the BI team. They're focused on the centralized data schemas and the aggregations across the company. We have the data infrastructure group for all the data flow, how we're collecting from across the world, different data centers, how we rapidly getting that data into systems for analytics. Then network level data analysts, they're also centralized as well. We also centralize the analysts. So this is a really key point for us. And I think Ken Rudin also talks about this. He's now at Facebook. What we do, instead of having all these groups hire their own analysts, is we embed them in the groups. So they report back to a central group, but and they have the schema, data, and architecture knowledge to really understand the data. And they're also required to be sharing the insights that they're gathering throughout these different groups and share them with the rest of the company. It's a part of their job. It's a part of their delivery. That their bonuses are even tied to it. Another key point is it's art plus science. It's not art versus science, particularly at Zynga. You might have heard that we're a very heavily metric-driven company. That's absolutely true. But when you're talking about something like game design, there's a huge amount of creativity that goes into that. You can't just drive that from metrics. So what I mean by that is arts, a lot of the ideas are just coming through creativity from our designers. Then the science is creating platforms and systems that allow us to experiment, iterate really quickly, get data back extremely quickly, and make decisions. So we're using that to listen to the players, not to really come up with what are the new game features, but to listen to the players afterwards. So now into the services and architecture. So I'm just going to start with, again, this is a list of, just within my team, which is the shared platform, the infrastructure for our Zynga platform, but also the analytics. There's a wide variety of databases that we use. So, again, on this point, right tool for the right job. Vertica isn't something that we use for everything. It's used for the analytics case. We have membases. We even use HBase for our messages platform, which is there's a massive amount of data in there. It makes a lot of sense in that case to be using that. We have Memcache, MemQ, Solar, Redis, Oracle. I think Voldemort's in there somewhere. And there's a new company that came up in June that we're looking at. We're also looking at VoltDB as well in a particular space. I'll talk a little bit about that with one of these systems. So this is more of a decision flow than a matrix. And I won't go through all of this, but this is where it can get a little controversial. But this is just my own opinion one at Zynga, based on investments that Zynga has made. We can talk about this later if some people are interested, but I was just going to highlight a few key points. I think Michael was saying he doesn't like unstructured versus structured. I really don't like that. I don't think that's the right question. I always start with the question, is the data schema or schemaless? Is the schema changing frequently? That's one of the key pivot points in my own decision making that drives me down one direction. If the data has schema, often go towards a SQL approach if there's some kind of ad hoc access going on, because you get much faster speed to the tune of 10 to 100x in a lot of cases. You can get less hardware, and we'll talk about some of those. We have, the data's there now, it's been proven. ZTRACK API, so this is one of the first services. So, this is where you make a pivot as a business. At Zynga, we started business intelligence early enough that we were able to do this. Instead of just letting all these products and features log data in whatever way they wanted, create tables at will, and then have analysts trying to figure out how everything's maps together at a network level later, which can be pretty much a nightmare sometimes if you start getting really large. We started off controlling that through the analytics group by delivering an API. So now we're applying structure, but it's semi-structured, from the moment it's logged. And then it's flowing into a controlled set of warehouse tables that are pretty diverse, but allows us to ask questions at a network level and do it extremely fast. So the APIs are PHP, Java, and Ruby, but now we have REST APIs as a part of what's called the Zynga API. The back end, we use Facebook Scribe, which is, highly recommend it. It's just been invaluable for us as a way for transferring messages around the world. Cloudera certainly has Flume as well, but for us, we started before that was out, and Scribe meets our needs. But it's, it's a great way for very fast messaging forwarding from around the world. Then we have custom Java that's loading the data into the database. 95% of it just straight up bulk loads where it's just getting pounded in. About 5% of it we're transforming before it goes into the database. So things like daily active users and things like that. But otherwise, we're pounded into Vertica, and then Vertica can just is incredibly fast at aggregating these data and joining tables. So we try not to do that stuff outside of the warehouse. So just one example of how we tried to get a semi-structured approach to it so we wouldn't have to be constantly changing schemas. And again, this turned out to be massively successful for Zynga. So we're 4 years in, and I can tell you this really worked. So here's just a generic one called ZTRACK count. This is where the user can just log a count of anything they want. We have a lot of other structured calls, but this one I kind of call the kitchen sink. It's literally like half of our daily flow is this kitchen sink where people are just throwing in counters and trying to find what the next useful thing is. But if you look at the end here, you see kingdom, phylum, class, family, genus. That's just something I threw in there to indicate that it's a taxonomy. And the users create these taxonomies at will. And then we give them reports. So the moment they put a few hooks into their game, they're able to get the data within 5 minutes of it actually being in the game. We give them taxonomy slicers where they can slice up and down these taxonomies, do funnels, and that turns out just to be incredibly powerful. That's what really unlocked the value of taking this sort of semi-structured relational approach. So the Vertica data warehouse, it's an MPP compressed column store. It's full ANSI SQL, which is something we really were hoping for in the beginning if we could do it. Took some years of working with Vertica to get at the scale that we're at, but they did it. And I look back now, and in the company, we consider it definitely a success. There was some massive risk we took early on in terms of going with it, but I'd say it definitely worked out. We get 6 to 9x compression on the data, extremely fast bulk loading, and querying. You'll hear some myths sometimes around compressed column stores are very slow loading. That might be from the old days 10 years ago when there was Sybase IQ and the others, but I can tell you with Vertica, the loading speeds are phenomenal. In fact, I haven't seen a database come close yet. On a single loading thread, we can get 300,000 to 900,000 rows a second. You can do 6 threads per node. So we're doing 60 billion rows a day. We're not even coming close to what we could be doing loading while doing ETL and normal queries. And queries that join across tables, again, on the raw data. 60% of our reports actually go against the raw data, not against aggregated data. So reporting and analysis. So stats.zynga.com. So now that's where we store the data. How do we surface it? So stats.zynga.com is a custom reporting site that we built in-house. We also use Tableau. When we need analysis cubes or fancier, nicer reporting, we'll use Tableau. But a majority of the reporting comes through a custom in-house system. There's about 6,000 distinct report types in there. Our DAU, daily active users internally, is around 1,080. In a week, we're getting 50% of the company using this system. 3,000 report runs per day, 500 to 600 distinct report types per day are run. And about 15,000 ad hoc queries per day. So that's not the ETL and the reporting queries. These are ad hoc queries being run not just by analysts, but because we have this open access policy. So you can see, at least it's clear to me that Zynga is definitely a metric-driven culture. These numbers have doubled since last year. They'll probably double again by next year. Ad hoc query, we talked about that. So we have analysts, product managers, engineers, and the BI team. They're all working to create insights, metrics, and profiles and operationalize them. So insights are great, but they don't mean anything unless you actually act on them, of course, right? So one of the ways that we enabled actually doing that is something we call data services. So Vertica is disk-based. We're not going to be serving web content at Zynga's level of 60 million users. It's not going to go against Vertica. So this is a case where we're using actually mem-based. So we have all that data that's flowing into Vertica. We're aggregating it at a network level, game, user level. We take those key metrics, we pump it out to in-memory, and then we have an API that sits on top. So now all these services and games can access this data. It's daily aggregated, and some of it's real time. So this is where we get a real competitive advantage, is able to make runtime decisions based on this data and actually affect gameplay or purchases or all sorts of things. So personalization, targeting, profiling, matchmaking, these are some of the areas that we use it in. Another key service is the experimentation platform. This one's critical. It's deeply embedded in everything we do. I think Michael, again, referred to how you have to be able to experiment, iterate, accept failure, move quickly. Facebook certainly has this philosophy, and I think we actually borrowed it from them by the time we started. And that works still, even, Zynga's grown quite a bit. We're almost 3,500 employees, but we still have that focus on engineering, particularly now. So the experimentation platform is one way where we have an easy system where games can just put hooks in their game, and then they can carve their audience into different study groups, get data back within minutes, and throttle up and down, add a new feature, go up to 5%. Is it working? Are there bugs? Maybe go up to 25%, see if people are at least, if it's got some legs to it, and then go up to 100%. If data looks good, they just leave it at 100%. They never have to go back and revisit the code. This one also is Java, PHP, and a REST API as part of our Zynga platform. We use it to impact game and platform design. At any given moment, you might see 3,000 to 5,000 experiments running within Zynga across the board. A lot of those fail. So this is one that we're particularly proud of, and there's actually a lightning talk later from Michael Fan, who's the primary developer, and Rushan Chen, if you want to get more details on it. I'm going to just highlight it at a high level. But one of the key things for Zynga was, Vertica's awesome for analytics, but sometimes we need even faster reporting for operational health, or even maybe taking actions within the game even faster. So we had a streaming tier early on, a streaming event tier. We were using open source called Esper. So the data's flowing in on ZTRACK Scribe. We just pump it into Esper. We'd aggregate that data, dump it into a single MySQL, and then we had reports coming off of that. And those reports would be really fast because it was aggregated data. But we quickly ran into scale issues. Esper does not scale. There's other proprietary companies out there, Truvizo, SQL Stream, missing one other, Streambase, but none of them had the scale issue solved that we suddenly hit, which was within a single category on Scribe, for example, we were doing 60 billion rows. And it turns out we really needed the raw data. In a lot of cases, we sampled for a little while, but that loss of resolution was just too much. So I went back with the team, and we architected a few different approaches, and we ultimately ended up building our own in-house streaming event tier. It's now doing 70 billion rows a day, and it could keep scaling. It uses custom Java for processing, memcaches and memqueues to relieve deadlocks and other issues that can cause backlogs. And then now, some of you might find this interesting, but MySQL cluster that was released in February, where they resolved a lot of these join issues. So instead of sharding and putting the shard logic in your application, MySQL now, they've had it for years, but I never was willing to use it because there were a lot of join issues. It was meant for a certain market. But in February, they released an update. And so we tried it, and it's actually working. It's working really well as the streaming event database. It's at 70 nodes now. We're working with them to try and go bigger. But we're also looking at MemSQL, who are working on a scalable. We're looking at VoltDB. This is another area that we need to solve. When you need to do ad hoc runtime queries, it's another big use case for Zynga that there's a lot of use cases, including matchmaking. So here's a little bit of the architecture. Right? Again, you can hit up Michael Fan or Rushan Chen in the lightning talk or later if you want more details. But we've got the Scribe data flowing in full to these readers and writers that are custom processing systems. And then we have memcaches and memqueues. And it took a fair amount of work to relieve all the bottlenecks that we were seeing, but it's working very well now. And then we have MySQL cluster on the back end accepting the data. So 3 minutes. So some of the streaming uses, the major one right now is operational health reporting. So we have our site reliability engineers and games that are looking at these monitoring and alerts, and we're triggering, say one of our APIs goes down, our service, or Facebook payments API goes down, or if one of the Facebook services goes down. We have instant alerts on these things, and we communicate to these groups and work with them to resolve the issues, because there is monetary cost to these, even if we're talking within a 5-minute time frame, if we're talking about payments in particular. We also use it to offload a lot of the stress on Vertica. So some of the key metrics like DAU and installs, you get product managers and developers, they're just pounding that constantly, especially if you get a game release, everybody's in there, what's the DAU, what's the daily active users, installs. And that puts a lot of stress on a disk-based system like Vertica if you're doing it. So what we've done with the streaming tier is we offloaded a lot of those reports to the streaming tier, and that's just worked fantastically well. We also use it as a separate way to validate what's going into Vertica. So in the future, what we're looking to leverage the streaming tier for as well is to be aggregating data in real time. So we're talking about less than a minute, whereas Vertica is about 5 minutes. This data is being aggregated and pumped out in less than a minute. There's some cases, particularly around payments, opportunities, where more timely data can have an impact. So that's where it's headed next. Just a quick slide on these last 3.5 years since BI really started at Zynga and where we're at now. We started with guessing. We were just capturing the events. Then we built the dashboards, alerts, and reporting to understand what happened. And then why did it happen? And now we're at the point where we are creating advantage. Now, certainly, we're just scratching the surface. There's a huge amount more that we can do. But there's things like data services and new game features that are coming through insights and things like that, where we have a lot of examples of how that's impacted the bottom line for the company. And I think I'll just leave it there, given that there's 40 seconds. I'll skip the summary pieces.